سلام و درود بر همه شما و متشکرم که تشریفتان آوردین و خدمتتون عرض می کنم. و همینطور که میتونید ببینین فارسی هم یک کمی خوبه، ولی اینقدر خوب نیست که من میتونم یه سخنرانی کامل ارائه بدهم. پس برای همین من این سخنرانی را به انگلیسی ارائه میدهم. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So when I got the invitation last week to give this talk, I had already had some materials prepared for talking in general about my research, my dissertation project, and the results of that. But I wanted to connect it a little bit more explicitly to the theme of the seminar. So I was thinking about the question of early urbanization. And specifically with respect to Iran. So in my dissertation research, one of the theories that I was working from in order to sort of build my theoretical intervention was coming out of this, what I consider to be classic article. And I suppose I'm not alone in that. But in any case, the Urban Revolution by V. Gordon Childe, which despite its age, having been written 70 years ago, still has quite a bit of influence over thinking about these questions related to urbanization. I mean, I suppose that shouldn't be any surprise to those of us. But I really, the reason why I went back to this, and I'll kind of work my way towards it, is that there was a recent volume published by MOM Editions on early urbanization in the Iranian plateau, which I believe was the result of a conference. And there are a lot of really interesting papers in there. And one of the more interesting papers, or one of the papers that caught my attention, at least in preparing for this talk, was the opening paper by, the name of the author is escaping me at the moment, Volka maybe. And in any case, he basically makes the argument that until the second millennium, at the very earliest, it's very difficult to make an argument for quote unquote urbanization in Bronze Age Iran, at least in comparison to that which is observed in Mesopotamia. So there's a lot of text on this slide, and we can come back to it. But I was really thinking about, what are the hallmarks of urbanization? What are the characteristics? How would we actually begin to evaluate this question of urbanization in early Iran? Not just, I think maybe the question is not to ask whether there is or is not urbanization, but what and how, what kinds of processes might resemble early forms of urbanization. How do we characterize these settlements? And I really, so one of the things that came out of my dissertation research was that we can talk endlessly about things like urbanization and polity formation and these theoretical models that have been developed in conversation with a number of different disciplines and been sort of cycled through multiple times over the decades. But so adopting the same approach that I use in my dissertation with respect to the question of polity formation, I think one of the things that's really necessary is to go back to the sort of empirical foundations and really be thinking about, like, what is it that we are actually observing and talking about when we talk about things like urbanization. Urbanization, what is the object of urbanization? It's the formation of an urban space, a city. And the trouble with the city concept is that it can be very difficult to define. And so one of the solutions that you find to this is the sort of listing of urban attributes. People working backwards from the present day and historically observed phenomena to try to identify what the characteristics and hallmarks of urbanism in the past might be. So I borrowed from this article by Michael E. Smith titled very aptly, How Can Archaeologists Identify Early Cities? And so the argument that he makes is basically that the question of is it a city or is it not a city is sort of analogous to Norman Yoffe's question of, is it a state, is it not a state? If you have to ask the question, there's a chance that it probably isn't, which I don't know how useful that is. However, there are these sort of cross-culturally applicable and valid observations of attributes that tend to signal different degrees of urbanism, shall we say. And so I didn't pull up the table from the article, but you could imagine this table on the slide sort of arranged with the column on the left, your rows, and then in the columns, as opposed to just the type here, we have each of the sites. So you could say Shahr Sukhte, you could say Tale Marion, you could say Tape Hisar, and go on and on and on, and fill in the table and see how they differ in terms of things like fortification, in terms of formal public space, in terms of the presence or absence of neighborhoods, the size, the density, etc. So the point really is a comparative analysis and trying to understand the historical processes that lead to the formation of the urban, so to speak. And so one of the other interesting questions too is the extent to which archaeology can contribute to this bigger, let's say, scholarly formation of quote unquote urban studies. And in fact, actually, a number of archaeologists have argued recently that archaeology is necessary for a theory of urbanization because the deep historical perspective and the cross-cultural perspective that we can provide offer some necessary correctives to theorization that is based entirely on modern examples. So one of the contributions here is that we can start to think about, okay, so we have our list of attributes, right? But there's also an extent to which cities are recognized not necessarily in terms of their, let's say, morphology and durable characteristics, such as those that we would observe as archaeologists. So one of the things that we run up against as archaeologists when talking about early urbanization is some of the limits of the kind of data that we can talk about. So in this article, they run through a bunch of different ways of approaching defining the urban. But what it comes down to is that the perspective that seems to be, let's say, emerging and hegemonic within urban studies writ large is that the essence of urbanism is not physical space per se, but the frequent and intense social interactions among a diversity of individuals within a given space. And so that presents us with some troubles as archaeologists because what we have is the physical space. And observing the frequent and intense social interactions among a diversity of individuals within that given space is a little bit more challenging. However, that should not prevent us from using all of these different types of data that we do have access to think through, what those, let's say, types of frequent and intense social interactions could be over space and time. So thinking about early cities, there, as I think most people in the audience are probably aware, there's a considerable body of literature on this subject. In recent years, there has been let's call it a synthesis of some kind, where there are quite a few people who really, building on, I would say, the work of David Schlone, have come to view these sort of early cities. And you also see this in the work of Jason as well. And he has a recent paper out about early Mesopotamian urbanism that I think is well worth reading. But in any case, so what are we looking at when we look at early cities? I think one of the perspectives that people have taken towards this recently is to think about cities as a social unit, or at least cities as a thing that are composed by smaller social units. And at this early stage, it really seems to be that what is happening is that there is a process by which smaller kin-oriented social groups are being agglomerated into larger social formations with or without what we would recognize as the urban fabric. In fact, the urban fabric, the attributes that I talked about before, are really the material outcome of these social processes by which groups of people are brought together in social allegiance to create these larger order political structures. So one of the things, what we see concretely as the city is this material residue of the process by which larger and more stable cooperative social groups are formed. And there's a variety of strategies by which, let's say, aspiring political leaders might undertake this. Or, as Jason argues, that there may not necessarily need to be some sort of top-down political authority, but rather that this is a bottom-up process that occurs as a sort of byproduct of all of this social interaction. So I'll just read the quote. Seen in this light, attributes of, what we consider to be hallmarks of urbanism, such as monumental temples, public works, feasts, and even acts of violence, were not necessarily actions taken by the state, but rather attempts by nascent leaders to build power across settlements organized around already existing cooperative units. I had planned to give some of my remarks vis-a-vis these topics in Farsi, but I think I did not prepare enough ahead of time to do that comfortably, so I'll just, we can come back to this in the Q&A. Okay, so one area in my dissertation research that did overlap more directly with the theme of the webinar series was in dealing with the theoretical work of Mauricio Tosi from the 70s and 80s. So those who know his work well know that for many years he was working on developing a theory of state formation in Middle Asia. It's really, to my mind, kind of unfortunate that that work never really got finished, because as it exists now, it is embodied in a series of articles and sort of short monographs that come in sequence, and each of the articles sort of presents this this theoretical model, and each of the subsequent articles sort of builds on and slightly modifies. So you don't get the whole picture all at once. It would be a wonderful thing if somebody could go through and systematize all of those pieces into some kind of, coherent final statement on the matter. But in any case, the sort of sequence of, let's say, urban development and state formation can be roughly summarized through this chart, with the different stages corresponding to the different absolute dates, which I spent quite a deal of time in my dissertation trying to pull apart exactly what the reference of these different, let's say, cultural historical periods, temporal frameworks, etc. But the point being is that by the mid-third millennium, Tosi sees a phase of state formation and urbanization across the sort of, let's say, the regions of Eastern Iran and Southern Central Asia, characterized by demographic agglomeration, specialized in spatially segregated production facilities, monumental architecture and public works, and social stratification. So one of the things that we'll come back to is that you can evaluate each one of these empirical claims on its own basis. You can also evaluate the temporal framework at use. But the fact of the matter remains is that this is a major touchstone for thinking about state formation, urbanization, cities, and so on in prehistoric Eastern Iran and Southern Central Asia. Right, so we can distill the narrative that, we have this peak of urban civilization in the quote-unquote Turanian basin, after which it suddenly collapsed, losing all of their features of centrality, and most of the cities are sharply reduced in size or abandoned within the span of a few centuries. Now, there's an interesting piece of this as well that I don't necessarily do too terribly much with, but which would be very, very interesting. And that is his argument to the effect of that the urbanism and the city are not necessary for a state-based social order in Middle Asia. And of course, it's not to say that, no work has been done on this question, but I think that's definitely an area for continued expansion and further research. It was Jan Valkemeyer, whose name I was searching for. In any case, he argues that the criteria for ancient urbanization are as follows. And on this basis, he argues that neither in Susa nor in Fars during the 3rd millennium BCE were there any evidence of urbanization. Instead, he sees the settlement patterns as developing out of village structures, and all of the fundamental characteristics of the origin of Mesopotamian cities and cities in general, he sees as lacking in the Iranian plateau during this time period. Now, I don't necessarily here propose to, tackle this full on or to provide any answers, the question of whether or not this is correct. But what I do want to present to you is the results of the case study that I conducted into the geography of polity formation as a way of suggesting, one of the ways that we might look at something like this, derive an answer to this question or push this line of inquiry further, is the sort of study that I did. And so one of the aspect of this that we're going to focus on mostly here is the relationship between the country and the city, settlement size and settlement organization. But I'm going to be looking at it from a regional perspective. this brings to a conclusion the first part of my presentation on the question of urbanization, which I may come back to towards the end of the talk, but I think I want to really drill into the evidence that I have assembled. I think the thing that I'm most excited about, at least, is to talk about the sort of like, let's say, the ways that you would actually evaluate arguments like this about urbanization, and the sort of like theoretical question that is encompassing all of this is interesting, and I think should be pursued further. But I'm not necessarily sure that that's going to be a major focus of my research going forward. And I'll come back to that and explain, I think, in more detail why that is the case towards the end of the talk. So, getting to my dissertation research, I put this slide together to sort of situate the case study that I worked with, which really came to scholarly attention about 100 years ago when the Russian classicist Mikhail Rostovtsev drew the first connections between the Gorgon plain and the wider world of the ancient Near East beyond. In commenting on what he called the Sumerian treasure of Astarabad, a rich hoard discovered at or in the vicinity of the region's largest site, Turing Tepe, Rostovtsev observed that the iconography of this collection of gold vessels, stone objects, copper tools, and weapons closely resembled the objects and images found in Egypt, southern Mesopotamia, and Elam dating to the 3rd millennium BC. Despite these resemblances, however, Rostovtsev argued that we should not understand these objects as imports produced in a distant land and brought to this remote corner. Instead, for him, their distinctive features indicated that these items were local products, albeit ones that exhibited cultural influences from far and wide. In subsequent decades, excavations at key sites in northeastern Iran at Turing Tepe, Tepe Hisar, Shah Tepe, Nargis Tepe, and Tepe Bozgir, among others, have added considerable material to this record of regional and interregional material connections. This work has shown that at different times, the Gorgon was more or less closely connected to both its near neighbors on the Iranian plateau and in Central Asia, as well as to more distant regions, including Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. And it also occurs to me now that I should perhaps backtrack a little bit and come back to the Gordon Childe urban revolution thesis. So one of the things that motivated me to be invested in and interested in this question, and which ties into the theme of the seminar, is that these early, let's say, complex social political formations in places like the Gorgon really figure into the broader picture of the ancient Near East with respect to the question of trade. And so for Childe, and then subsequently this model of trade, and I think maybe I'll get into it a little bit later, but in any case, the idea was that long distance elite driven trade was a driver of polity formation. We can get into the specifics of how the process worked, where there's the sort of like the need to supply craft industries with non-local raw materials, then sort of over time helped produce and then entrench the division of labor, and then resulted over time in the class formation and then social stratification, ultimately the state, so on and so forth. And that's in the case of quote unquote primary state formation. And so I got really interested in this question of secondary state formation, what the deal is with all of the polities that might have emerged in Middle Asia a la Tosi in response to and subsequently to those primary polity formations in Mesopotamia, and the role of trade in that whole process. So let's jump back forward again. Right. So the archaeological landscape of the Gorgon has been surveyed numerous times, resulting in the identification of hundreds of tell settlements dating to the 3rd millennium. This extensive record of settlement, alongside the evidence for monumental architecture at Turing Tepe, advanced craft industries, rich burials, and the regional and interregional connections first noticed by Rostovtsev, have led scholars to hypothesize that the region was home to some form of early complex polity or polities during the Bronze Age, particularly between circa 2500 and 2000 BCE. Thus, since the 1970s at least, the Gorgon Plain has been considered a constituent part of broader social and historical trajectories, comprising the emergence of larger scale communities and polities in Eastern Iran, the Persian Gulf, the Indo-Iranian borderlands, etc., during the second half of the 3rd millennium. So the central research question of my dissertation was from circa 3200 to 1600 BCE, that is from the late Chalcolithic through the late Bronze Age, how did the social and political geography of northeastern Iran change over time? and how were these changes related to shifting patterns of interregional trade and exchange. So what I aimed to show in my dissertation was that the inclusion of the Gorgon in discussions of this broader pattern of quote unquote secondary state formation in the quote unquote lands east of Sumer is not necessarily a mistake in principle, but that the reason behind this inclusion has not been rooted in a detailed examination of either the Gorgon's settlement geography or its record of involvement in interregional trade and exchange. So based on the case study of legacy survey and excavation data, satellite imagery analysis, and spatial modeling, I argue that the social political geography of this region is far more spatially and temporally varied than previously assumed. And two, that while the settlement record does not necessarily contradict the hypothesis that polities formed during the second half of the third millennium, that is the period of this region's greatest involvement in interregional trade. The problem is basically that while the settlement record does not necessarily contradict the hypothesis that polities formed during the second half of the third millennium, the period of this region's greatest involvement in interregional trade is not only later than had been previously assumed, but in fact correlates to a period of political geographic fragmentation rather than one of polity formation. So we're going to unpack that, and I kind of stumbled through reading it, but in any case, I think it'll become clear over time that empirically speaking, the period in which there is the greatest evidence from the settlement record of quote unquote polity formation precedes a period of increased participation in interregional trade, as opposed to succeeding, which would be what we would expect from the Gordon-Childe model. So broadly, this finding has implications for the quote-unquote secondary state formation model in general, which we'll get to in more detail. Yeah, let's talk about the Gorgon Plain and the broader geographic context in terms of the physical landform, culture history, et cetera. And then I think from there, I'll come back to some of the issues related to my central research question that I've already sort of alluded to. And then we'll dive into the case study. So I think maybe we can skip through some of this stuff. These slides were put together for a different audience. I think pretty much everybody here is familiar with these maps. But for those who aren't familiar with, let's say, social and political geography of the third millennium of the Iranian Plateau, we have these sort of broadly defined culture areas. I adapted this map from Phil Cole's book, The Making of Bronze Age Eurasia, and then sort of added to it, I guess, my own sort of perception, but also the more like recent monographs that have appeared. And so this is, of course, the specific zone that I'm talking about. So I think as many people will be aware, each of these different, let's say, bubbles is considered to be home to some form of early complex polity during the third millennium, one way or another. And so this is following again from Tosi, where you can sort of divide the physical geography of the Iranian Plateau into a number of different categories based on their elevation above sea level and their sort of relationship to the mountains and desert. As you can see from this chart, the Gorgon is somewhat unique relative to the other major areas of settlement. So really the only other part of, say, the Iranian Plateau and the surrounding areas that physically resembles the Gorgon according to this typology is Susa, the plains of Khuzestan. What to make of that parallel, I'm not entirely sure. In any case, the point being is that I think as people well know, the Gorgon and its nearby areas are tremendously well watered relative to many other parts of the Iranian Plateau. Of course, not nearly as much as Mazandaran or Gilan, for example, but certainly much more than the Middle East as a whole, generally speaking. And then also just, right. And then so the thing to pay attention to in this map, of course, is the purple line, which is derived from the map of T.J. Arna, and which delineates the boundary between the forest steppe and the desert steppe, as it was in the 1930s. And as we will see later, the bulk of the prehistoric settlement is pretty close to this line. And that raises some questions about paleoecology and the agricultural potential of this region in a historical perspective. But some of those questions sort of exceed the remit of what we're going to talk about here today. Right, so coming back to the question of trade and polity formation. Yeah, so as I sort of alluded to before, this study emerges out of an engagement with a central problem in the archaeology of the ancient Near East. That is, how to understand the non-literate but complexly organized societies with whom Mesopotamia had demonstrable trade and exchange relations and what this trade meant for all parties involved. So these regions, including the Persian Gulf, the Indus Valley, Central Asia, and the Iranian Plateau, clearly had non-trivial contact with Mesopotamia during the Bronze Age. The nature, frequency, duration, and impact of this contact on political and social developments in these areas have, however, been disputed. What we do know is that each such region that constituted what some have called the quote-unquote Bronze Age world system had complex social and political geographies. But in almost all cases, the settlement data available for many of these regions has been under-examined since it was collected. This has lamentably left many key questions about the regional demography and political geography of these areas a matter of speculation, especially in the so-called peripheral zones, such as my study area. And in the broader context, the broader context of Turan. As I sort of pointed to before, a lot of this work has been left unfinished and speculative due to interruptions in field research and complications related to the political situation that meant that people who had previously been working on synthesizing the regional culture history of all these places would go on to move to other countries and leave much of their early work unfinished. So we're going to come back to Gordon Childe again. Yes. So what I want to focus on here is the macro historical narratives that have connected trade to political geography and archaeology more generally. So there's a relatively stable and interdisciplinary consensus that has cohered around a narrative that connects the emergence of early complex polities during the Bronze Age to the intensity of that area's participation in interregional trade. This consensus finds its roots in V. Gordon Childe's classic article, The Urban Revolution, in which he presents his now famous 10 criteria for distinguishing a new stage in the economic and political evolution of society, which we are still living in today, namely the state system. As part of this argument, Childe posits that regular long-distance foreign trade was a necessary feature of the emergence of early civilizations because the first city-states located in the southern Mesopotamian alluvium were dependent upon the acquisition of vital, but not locally available raw materials to support their craft industries. Over the course of several subsequent articles, Childe elaborated on how he understood this process, coming to argue that this dependence on foreign raw materials for craft production both created and constituted the division of labor in society as such, that is, the stable distinctions between agricultural producers and non-food producing specialists. This process began in Mesopotamia circa 3500 BC as communities and nascent polities in the southern alluvium managed to both produce and concentrate an agricultural surplus. This surplus made it possible to support new classes in the population, namely priests, administrative officials, and an array of craft producers. This surplus also made it possible to trade with neighboring regions for raw material inputs for craft industries that were not available in Mesopotamia, but which were plentiful in neighboring areas such as Iran. Childe argued that this process then became a feedback loop where those who controlled craft production and who benefited from this control sought ever greater benefit and ever greater control, which resulted in the emergence of entrenched social stratification and the kinds of class divisions that distinguish state societies from non-state societies. Thus, the need to pay for the importation of necessary raw materials drove the further concentration of surpluses, both agricultural and material cultural. Moreover, and getting to the point that I want to make here, with respect to quote unquote secondary state formation, this relationship between agricultural surplus, the division of labor in society, and the acquisition of raw materials not only played a role in Mesopotamian polity formation, but also played a key role in propagating the quote unquote urban revolution outward. That is, once the material flows were organized according to the circulation of concentrated agricultural surpluses as a form of early fungible capital used to pay for the imports of exotic raw materials, all of the communities located in the source regions and all of the communities located along the routes by which these materials were conveyed were drawn into this process. So without getting into all of the finer details, being drawn into such an exchange network based on the extraction and circulation of agricultural surpluses and raw materials led to the emergence of a division of labor in these societies as well. To use Childe's own prose, the local chieftain's court would thus come to reproduce, on an albeit smaller scale, a center for the concentration of a surplus, and therefore become a new center for the demand for raw materials. Thus, from 3000 BC onward, across Iran and the other regions adjacent to Mesopotamia, this process drove the transformation of some villages into prosperous towns by virtue of their good fortune to have been situated near sources of raw materials or along trade routes. Though these towns were able to support specialist craftspeople and depended on imported raw materials, they were not so rich as the Mesopotamians to the point that they required or developed a system of writing, and therefore were not quote unquote cities, even as they quote unquote partook to some extent in the new urban economy. So Child's thesis is both compelling and thought-provoking, and also has been remarkably stable in terms of its uptake and reformulation within, let's say, theoretical archaeology in the 70 years since it was first proposed. But there are a number of different problems with it, and of course, I'm not suggesting here that we, take it in any way for granted or uncritically. So I guess the points forward for me with this is that while it's a nice theory, large parts of it are, I think, unverifiable, or at least perhaps in the case of the state of affairs of, let's say, Middle Asian archaeology, there are crucial gaps that would be extraordinarily difficult to piece together. And also, perhaps more importantly, there's a 70 more years worth of evidence of excavations and surveys and data to speak to these questions that were, impossible to incorporate at the time. Now, nevertheless, you still have in 2019 Meyer making ostensibly the same argument that these, let's say, as Child put it, some villages were transformed into prosperous towns, but there still seems to be the agreement that these are not cities. So kind of echoing some of what I was just saying is that Child's formula underpins many, if not all, subsequent theories about episodes of polity formation in the ancient Near East, which scholars have consistently linked to phases of reorganization and the networks of interaction that tied the ancient Near East together. So one of the classic examples of this is Lambert-Karlowski's 1985 article drawing on the Braudelian framework to explain the sort of long-term, the longue durée historical processes and conjunctures that constitute this process. So again, this is not necessarily a framework that I take without a grain of salt, so to speak. I think that at an extremely zoomed out level, there's something to this, but as you get more granular, the coherence of it starts to break down a bit. But in any case, this is a useful, okay. Well, in any case, what I want to do is sort of unpack it at a little bit more. So even though I said that it starts to break down in its coherence at a more granular level, we do need to deal with what all of these coherences and incoherences are. So the narrative that this article presents is that interregional trade networks were first primed by an episode of acculturation to a model of administrative technology for the organization of and control of primary production developed first in Mesopotamia during the late 4th millennium BC. The transfer of this model of production and the exchange of the commodities whose manufacture it afforded is understood to have stimulated the formation of new political institutions in neighboring regions in a very good Childian fashion. So in the case of Iran, this process began at Susa with the Proto-Elamite phenomenon, which is presumed to have spread this model of managed or administrated craft production as far as Tepe-Hisar and Shahr-Sukh. This event converged temporally and partially overlapped spatially with the formation of another interaction sphere originating in the Kopet-Dagh Piedmont of southern Turkmenistan. Together, these two networks constituted an overland system of down-the-line exchanges between proto-urban centers. This period is understood to be one in which some large villages grew into proto-urban towns and began to become more hierarchically differentiated through a nascent division of labor between primary food producers and administrative/craft producing specialists. In the following phase, the Persian Gulf supplanted the Iranian plateau as the spatial focus of exchange, drawing together a much larger assemblage of actors into a principally maritime trade network. This period has been viewed as one in which political authorities, particularly in Mesopotamia, became much more directly involved in the procurement of commodities from distant sources. Moreover, this phase has been viewed as one in which early complex polities formed across many parts of the Iranian plateau and beyond, indicated by both the increased size and complexity of the central sites in various regions and the historical record of the many named political geographic entities known from Mesopotamian texts. The final phase is characterized by a complete reconfiguration of trade networks with a greater emphasis on Mediterranean circuits of exchange on the one hand, but also what we now know to be the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, the Oxus civilization, or the greater Khorasan culture. This shift, as it was understood before much was known about the BMAC, purportedly caused the quote-unquote collapse of the polities in the lands east of Sumer and the abandonment of their urban centers, which had formed and thrived during the preceding period. Paradoxically, this final phase is marked by the emergence of trans-Caspian trade, linking Central Asia to Assyria and Anatolia across the northern Iranian plateau. That is what I like to refer to, and this is something that I'm going to continue working on, I think, and that is the emergence of the Great Khorasan Road. And moreover is associated with the emergence of the Khanate in southern Central Asia as an enduring socio-political structure. So with respect to this broad narrative, while the evidence for the different regions' participation in such trade networks at various points in time is irrefutable, the role that this exchange played in polity formation is more often assumed than demonstrated. Indeed, the formation of long-distance trade networks may turn out to be as much a result as a cause of polity formation. Okay, so that's a long preamble to getting into my concrete empirical research. So I want to break down my central research question into two pieces, and to say that for many of the regions that constituted the Bronze Age world system, the evidence required to answer such questions is fragmented, incompletely published, or both. And additionally, what information is published is written in English, French, German, Italian, Russian, Japanese, and Persian, all of which were consulted for this project, although I really only have facility in English, Persian, and Russian. So consequently, our understanding of the organization of the societies and polities that took place in the Iranian plateau across this interval has remained limited, in no small part due to this fragmentation of archaeological knowledge. So a lot of my empirical work was addressed directly at this problem of how to integrate the results of many different forms of archaeological research conducted over the course of numerous decades and within distinct archaeological traditions. Right, okay, so with respect to this first question, there's sort of two intermediary models, one of which I've already introduced to a certain extent. And the reason why I picked out both of these with respect to my study of the geography of polity formation is because when it comes to the discussion of social and political developments in Eastern Iran and Southern Central Asia during the Bronze Age, there's really only two that talk about settlement patterns in any sustained fashion. So the two models are, the two models that I focused on are Mauricio Tosi's proto-state structures and Phil Cole's secondary states east of Sumer, both of which argue for a phase of polity or state formation during the Persian Gulf focused phase of trade exchange and polity formation in the narrative that I introduced a few minutes ago. That is phase 2 or the mid-3rd millennium BC. So while each such model invokes a range of different parameters for discerning the presence of such socio-political units, they both ultimately rely on the same data. But from these same data, they manage to draw opposite conclusions, actually. In the former, the polities of Bronze Age Iran are understood to be as hierarchical, as elite-dominated, and as territorially controlling as contemporaneous Mesopotamian polities, whereas in the latter, these units are seen as much less nucleated, much less densely populated, and less hierarchical. Crucially for this investigation, both Tosi and Cole make claims regarding regional settlement distributions in support of their models, with the former arguing for strongly centralized and ranked settlement systems, and the latter arguing for more hierarchical and decentralized settlement systems. Importantly, both of these models tie this episode of polity formation to the respective regions' increased involvement in interregional trade, at least partly stimulated by Mesopotamian demand for raw materials sourced in the regions where these polities took shape. So on one level, I have worked to resolve this concrete empirical issue by expanding the evidence base that we can draw on to understand this history of organizational transformations in these societies in terms of their settlement geography. So my approach then extends beyond the set of spectacular features known from the large, quote unquote, central sites that have typically been the focus of excavation, to instead examine these processes from a broader regional perspective. And as I've said, to do so, I had to draw on a vast but fragmentary record of partially published and underanalyzed survey data to reconstruct the social and political geography of the Gorgon Plain during the Bronze Age. For those who are familiar with these sources, they really are rich, but they're somewhat difficult to work with for a variety of different reasons. So one of the big empirical tasks in my dissertation was to go through these and really systematically evaluate the validity and reliability of all of the information presented, and to integrate the different the different cartographies into a single data environment, such that patterns could actually be discerned rather than just looking at dots on a map. So what that entailed was the construction of these database models in order to, in the first stage, to extract all of the information as it existed in the sources, and then to reconfigure that information in a way that the data could be queried and ported into different software packages in order to perform this first sort of what's called a virtual site survey, and then second to do the settlement pattern analysis and the spatial modeling. And also another aspect of this that had to be done was that not all of these surveys had a chronology attached to them. In fact, only one. Now, that said, many of the surveys had chronological data that could be used. So in the case of the Arne survey of the Gorgon from the 1930s, I went to Sweden and spent a summer in the basement of a museum in Stockholm documenting the pottery from that survey, and trying to use that to work backwards to date some of these the sites from the archaeological map of the Turkmen steppe. And then I also used the Orban Ali Abbasi's monograph, which has a series of maps that present the site locations organized by chronology. So one of the challenges was to integrate all of those different forms of spatial and temporal data. And then subsequent to that, I took all that information and put it into Google Earth, which in total looks like this. But for each of the sites, I took the information from the database and put it into Google Earth and visited, so to speak, each of the different geographic markers to investigate whether or not there was a site remaining in that location, and to document the size and features and let's say state of preservation of the site. And also crucially, which I think you may be able to see a little bit in this slide, but maybe not, a large number of the sites have been very visibly looted, which is a subject that I'm going to pursue in further work. In any case, this is just sort of an outline of the data that in aggregate, in total, the integrated database has over 1,000 sites in it based on the 5 sources that I used. But in terms of unique site locations dating to the time period of interest, I narrowed it down to 240, out of which I was able to locate successfully 75%. And so all the subsequent analyses that you're going to see have been, the sample size has been reduced down to unique sites that date to the time period that I was able to identify. And then, well, and it's already sort of in there, that sites that actually had chronological information attached to them in some form or another. All right, so the results of the settlement distribution study. So with the time periods broken down into the late Chalcolithic, early Bronze Age, and middle Bronze Age, these are some of the patterns that we observe. I think the most interesting thing about this is that over time, the greatest frequency of sites that you see are small sites. And really the overwhelming plurality of sites are smaller than 2.5 hectares. And interestingly, you have the greatest extent of aggregate settlement occupation during the early Bronze Age. And so there's a major increase from the Chalcolithic to the early Bronze Age, and then a steady tailing off of the overall aggregate occupied hectareage over time. But at the same time, the average size of the sites increases. So over the course of this interval, just in a pure like settlement geography perspective, what you see from the early Bronze Age through to the late Bronze Age is that there are fewer sites, but the sites are larger. So yeah, this slide we can come back to. You can sort of see the different size categories of sites and how they change over time. I think based on the visual inspection of these plots, one of the things that's interesting is that there really seem to be sort of 3 distinct zones of settlement in the Gorgon plain, which is most clearly visible, I would say, during the early Bronze Age map on this slide. Just some more sort of summary statistics. This chart is using the temporal framework of strict contemporaneity, which I'll get back to. But the point is that so I did some analytical work to harmonize the chronological framework inherent in Abbasi's survey and what was available from Arne and Shiomi and so on, with the macro historical narrative that I introduced from Lambert Karlowski a little bit earlier. Yeah, and I'm wondering now where, aha, right. Okay, So this is maybe, I think maybe I want to come back to this, but the important point is that one of the ways that I was really careful about doing settlement pattern analysis was to try to avoid the problem of map overfilling. So when you have these long cultural historical periods like early Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age, et cetera, what you're actually looking at when you look at a settlement distribution map is a palimpsest, meaning the settlement distribution is a historical record, not a snapshot in time. And in order to do, let's say, spatial, social, and political organizational modeling, you need to have a snapshot in time where you know that all of the settlements that you're looking at are contemporaneously occupied. So perhaps for the Q&A, we can get into some of the more technical details about how that actually played out. And I guess we can kind of come back to some of these more basic settlement distribution maps. So I've thrown a lot of information out at you about the settlement pattern distribution so far. But analytically speaking, I want to come back to the question of polity formation and the relationship to urbanism. And this is more detail about how I harmonize the different chronological frameworks in order to arrive at my different time slices. But the important thing here is that this is the key for grasping the historical sequence that I'm talking about. So in the first column, you have the Tosi's framework with both the phase names and the absolute dates. And then you have, on the one hand, the Gorgon. So in the third column, you have the Gorgon regional culture history, then translated into absolute dates, which more or less, split the difference between they fall right in the middle of Tosi's phases, and then they correspond to these different slices of strict contemporaneity and these broad temporal. So to get back to Tosi and how he describes the settlement geography and political organization according to this temporal arrangement, what he sees during this early phase is micro-regional political units with these increasing differentiation of centers and villages. Well, I think there's a lot to say about this, and I've already been talking for 50 minutes, so I think I want to just jump to the meat of it. So basically, on the basis of, so for each of the time periods, the way that I ended up modeling what I consider to be, oh, hold on, I've gotten ahead of myself here. So the point of this slide was to translate Mauricio Tosi's empirical description of the patterns of social and political organization into terms that I could actually model in GIS. So a couple of key factors here. Tosi defines a quote unquote center as any settlement larger than 10 hectares. Tosi provides both upper and lower territorial thresholds for the zone that these centers could have controlled, and he predicts the morphology of the organizational profile of these settlement distributions. And so what these slides show is what Tosi's model of polities would look like in the Gorgon across the 3 time slices. So according to the parameters of Tosi's model, during the T sub 1 or the early 3rd millennium, you would have 2 polities with 2 centers controlling these territories like so. And then during the mid 3rd millennium, Tosi's modeling parameters would see 4 polities in the Gorgon with centers arranged like so, and then the territories that they controlled. And during the late 3rd millennium, early 2nd millennium, you would return to a situation in which there were only 2 polities. So methodologically speaking, for each of the time periods, as you could see, what I did was I created a radius around each center according to the territorial estimates that Tosi provides, and assigned all sites that fell within those radii as dependent to that center, and thus members of the polity that that center would have controlled according to his theory. So it should be noted that each of these time slices corresponds to the macro historical trajectory of interregional relations that we discussed before. I would say on the basis of this table, Tosi's model doesn't really work very well for explaining the social and political geography of the Gorgon for one reason really important among all of the reasons, and that is that according to this framework, most of the sites of the Gorgon don't belong to any polity. And that, for a variety of reasons, is sort of analytically unsatisfying. So without getting into all the details, Right, these are the problems with the model. So over more than half of the sites in all the periods fall outside of the catchments of these centers. Then moreover, the number of sites that fall into these polity catchments as defined by Tosi's modeling parameters, very, very small. All but one of the modeled territories have a primate rank size distribution, which we can come back to later, perhaps. I guess to tie together what may have seemed sort of a disjointed discussion over the last couple of minutes, what this was really all about was the question of whether or not there's any evidence in the Gorgon, according to Tosi, for demographic agglomeration or for a settlement hierarchy. And what I'd like to argue on the basis of this modeling experiment and then the subsequent stuff that I'm going to perhaps talk about or perhaps sort of skip over more quickly is that no, not exactly. Right, so we talked about how to, yeah, all right. So this is the sort of basis by which I modeled these community and polity groupings. Now, what I want to be very, very clear about here is that this is entirely heuristic. I do not necessarily believe that a political social unit can be identified just by drawing a line and then a circle from that line and counting everything inside that as a member of the polity. But that's more or less the logic that Tosi used when he was making these arguments. And so in order to evaluate the empirics of his model and to take a step forward, I felt that it was really necessary to translate his theory into terms that could actually be evaluated using a GIS. And then to see where it works, see where it doesn't work, and propose alternative models on that basis. So instead, what I ended up doing was to basically, whereas Tosi's model is top down, it's the identification of social units and territories really comes from the centers, right? So my question was, what if we model the organization of multi-site communities and then eventually perhaps polities if we work bottom up? So instead of drawing a circle around the centers and identifying which settlements fall within that circle, what you would do then is to identify the territory that could potentially belong to every settlement and to see how they scale up as you zoom out. And that so basically the question there is rather than including small sites as dependent to centers, you find sites that would be within a reasonable let's say distance socially and physically from each other to constitute an actual viable human community. So there's a variety of different estimates by which that can be done. And we can all argue until we're blue in the face about what the characteristics and the thresholds for that are. But the point is that human communities are constituted by, much as we discussed earlier with the question of urbanization, it's a community is as much a place in which people interact as much as it is a physical location. However, the zone of interaction is certainly modelable hypothetically at the very least. So that's more or less what all of this is about, is just trying to figure out okay, on the basis of the locations that we know at the time periods that we know, what would be a feasible model of these community territories, and then on that basis of these community territories, what could possible polity territories look like as well. And so this is what it looks like over time. We have our first time slice, the early third millennium. We have our second time slice, the mid third millennium, and our third time slice, the late third millennium. These are the results of the bottom-up territorial modeling. And really the takeaway here is that on the basis of this way of modeling settlement, community, and polity geography, what we see is that the number of multi-community polities that could potentially have existed on the basis of this settlement record over time decreases from 5 in the early time period to 2 in the middle time period, and then increases to 8 in the later time period. And I'm going to skip over the rank size stuff because we can get into this in the question and answer session, but I don't really put a lot of stock in rank size analysis as a viable mode for inferring political organization in archaeology. That's a much longer conversation. I'm happy to have it, but I've been talking for a long time already. The big takeaways from my work on political geography is that as I was kind of saying, territoriality is more than proximity. So even though I used proximity as a way to model territory, of course, it's much more complicated than that. We should beware of any kind of certainty with respect to rank size analysis. And then to circle back around to the sort of like two intermediate theories that I was dealing with, I think Cole's model fits the Gorgon data much better than Tosi's. And then also that there's quite a bit of variation in time and space. And of course, we can delve into the details of what that variation is and what it might mean. Coming back to this question about the interregional trade, I kind of gave it away already with respect to what I think is going on here. And I think, so maybe if I can pull a couple of threads together more clearly, what I see in terms of the thinking back to Tosi's framework and to all of the theoretical stuff that I talked about at the beginning is that what we see in the Gorgon is perhaps a period of more in a larger scale polity formation, perhaps with an urban center at Turing Tepe during the mid-3rd millennium and perhaps into the late 3rd millennium with this large so in the middle of the screen here, this sort of like light green unit, which could potentially be a large regional territorial polity. However, with respect to the question of trade, the Gorgon's participation in interregional trade really comes later during this period where the political geography of the Gorgon, as I have defined it, is much more fragmented. And the basis for that argument is more or less that they're really, when you look at the broad span of the 3rd millennium in the Gorgon, you know, there is a lot of evidence for interaction in ceramics and various craft industries with immediately neighboring regions, so the Damghan and the Kopet Dag. But it's only at the very end of the 3rd millennium and into the 2nd millennium that you start seeing these broader interregional patterns of trade and exchange that would constitute the kinds of long distance trade that Gordon Childe was talking about with respect to polity formation and so on. And so one of the major areas for continuing research, as I see it, is to explain what on earth is going on with the Bozgir hoard and the Astarabad treasure that I started with. So there's already been quite a bit of work on all of this, but I think one of the things that is really important is to understand why, so what, to trace out at a really broad perspective all of these different parallels and to try to do our best to understand the precise timing of this. But my sense is that based on certain iconographical parallels, this one, for example, these as well, that it's a pretty restricted time period that we're talking about, maybe the last 2 centuries of the 3rd millennium, the first 2 centuries of the 2nd millennium, when all of this is happening. And I think that the Gorgon is playing a really important role in the transmission of Central Asian cultural ideas, actual material culture objects, raw materials, etc., to the West, and specifically to northern Mesopotamia and to central Anatolia, which is where a lot of the, so one of the things that I have become intrigued by, particularly recently, is the parallels between the materials from the Astarabad treasure and the Bozgir hoard with Kultepe Kanish in modern day Turkey. And for those people who are more familiar with that, there's this big question of what was the source of all of the tin that was used in making the bronze during the middle and late Bronze Age, and the question of whether it came from the East. I don't necessarily have the answer to that question, but it does seem to me that there is quite a bit of evidence for East-West connections during this time period, and I really see the Gorgon plain as a major mediator of those connections. So to bring it all the way back together, this is really what I see as the sort of my answer to Tosi, Lambert-Karlowski, etc. How we can put it all together here. So to answer my central research question, I argue that the period in which the Gorgon experiences the greatest volume and intensity of interregional trade correlates to a period of political geographic fragmentation and instability rather than one of stability and consolidation. This result stands in contrast not only to Tosi's predictions, but it also raises the question of the role of trade in stimulating secondary state formation more broadly. Okay, so one of the things that I'd like to leave everybody with here is some of my thoughts about what the more valuable contributions of this work might be in a long-term perspective, because I think with respect to the question of these models of urbanization, state formation, and the very concrete questions about settlement patterns and patterns of trade and connection, that's just going to be an accretionary process that will continue to accrue over time as new evidence comes to light. More or less, I would expect that all of my conclusions, or I treat all of my conclusions as provisional at best. So at the same time that I think that all of my archaeological and historical argumentation has broader implications for our understanding of the Bronze Age world system and the archaeology of political geography, I believe that the strongest and most lasting contribution that my dissertation has made is addressed to a much more general problem, one which I hope to address more systematically in the next phase of my career, and that is dealing with the curation crisis. And the curation crisis is an idea proposed some time ago now, but which has been talked about quite a bit more recently, is where newly excavated materials are stored away at a much faster rate than they can be studied. And in the case of countries like Iran, a large number of American archaeological excavations worked in Iran from the 1930s to the 1970s, and though there have been since the 1970s, a large number of researchers who have continued to work on this material, there's far more material than these researchers or even twice as many researchers could deal with in their entire lifetimes. And so one of the big questions facing archaeology in the United States, but also the archaeology of Iran, and specifically the archaeology of Iranian antiquities that are located in the United States, is what are we supposed to do with the already existing backlog of museum collections, archival materials, survey and excavation reports that have already waited for years and years, and sometimes decades, to be systematically analyzed. And I speak from intense personal experience here, in the sense that all of my work on Turing Tepe was preceded by only one study. That material was excavated in 1931, and the only thing that happened to it before I got to it in 2011 was one master's thesis written in the 60s. And that to me is a real tragedy. And so this becomes an especially salient question when access to the field is restricted for American archaeologists. But it's also a major problem when geopolitics makes it such that researchers from countries like Iran, where these collections originated, cannot easily come here to study these collections either. Yeah, as I was saying, there are large collections of Iranian antiquities stored at places like the Penn Museum, the Oriental Institute, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and elsewhere, which are being studied, and I should say actively by my committee members, for example, Holly Pittman, who was supposed to give this talk today, and by people in the audience, I should also say, and by myself. But like I said, there's more material than any of us could study in several lifetimes. So as a discipline, I think that archaeology should take more seriously the legacies of American empire and the vast accumulation of the cultural heritage of other countries. We must ask ourselves, have we been the best stewards of this material that we can be? Regardless of whether the answer is yes or no, we can be fairly certain that the odds of being compelled to repatriate much of this material are quite low. So then the question becomes, what should we do going forward? And so what I'm getting at here is that though people are working on these, our numbers are too small considering the scope of the problem, especially when you look beyond a single institution or the materials from just one country. I really would like to argue that we should be putting more resources into and valorizing the rehabilitation and study of such questions to make the information that they contain more widely accessible. As I wrote in a recent conference paper, the Code of Ethics for the Society for American Archaeology, in fact, includes a statement to this effect that this is one of our disciplinary mandates. But while things are changing, in my view, I think the argument is still valid insofar as funding agencies and the discipline at large continue to over-prioritize new fieldwork as both the primary mode of professional advancement and the field's ultimate end-all be-all purpose, thereby exacerbating the curation crisis. I guess what I'd like to suggest there, is that the kind of work that I did for my dissertation of reanalyzing these old museum collections, taking old monographs, old maps, doing the hard work of integrating these fragmentary sources of information to build these digital database infrastructures to conduct archaeological analysis, is not only necessary from a conservation preservation standpoint, but is also, you know, can push the field forward theoretically as well. Now, in my case, I didn't really have, due to the pandemic and a variety of other factors, as much time to spend on the theoretical aspect of the thesis. However, the concrete empirical work that I did, I think, will hopefully stand the test of time. And you know, one of my priorities going forward in my career is to increase the scope of that kind of work, of rehabilitating legacy museum collections and doing this integrative synthetic research, and more importantly, to do it with all of you, to bring more researchers into the process and to create these regional databases that can be used to ask big questions about the archaeology we run. So, thank you.